Just like a household, the government has a finite budget. It needs to decide on what prerogatives it's going to spend money and how much. But with relatively high debt levels, National Treasury has been looking to cut expenditure and reprioritise spending with its limited resources. For the 2022-2023 fiscal year, they penciled in a decline in non-interest spending of around 0.5%.
That's predicated on a few things which we know are unlikely. For example, it's predicated on the termination of the social relief of distress grant at the end of this fiscal year. It's predicated on a series of 0% wage increases for public sector workers, which we now know we've departed somewhat from. And it's not clear that there are sort of big areas of expenditure currently that the government can easily cut without having an impact on frontline delivery.
Finance Minister Godongwana is expected to make a pronouncement on the much-anticipated issue of the basic income grant. Some believe that the social relief of distress grant, which was introduced at the height of the COVID pandemic, could become a permanent feature.
So our expectation remains that the COVID relief of distress grant will become a permanent feature. I think one needs to say that in the NTBPS, they won't necessarily specifically provide for this. In other words, you won't necessarily see a line item that says COVID relief of distress grant and it continues indefinitely or throughout the forecast period. I think what government will do instead is to just have a very large unallocated reserve, which is what they've done in this budget as well.
But some argue that given government's limited fiscal position, it's imprudent to create a greater social dependency and that stimulating economic growth, which leads to job creation, should be the main focus.
I understand the view around the safety net, but we must not start something which is going to continue destroying this country, given that there isn't much to go around anyway, because there's no growth.
The Finance Minister has recently indicated that detailed announcements will be made about Eskom's debt come Wednesday. The markets are expecting that the government will take on between 150 to 250 billion rand of Eskom's debt, giving it some financial breathing room, enabling it to borrow further to invest in improved capacity. But the government is expected to make longer-term decisions about SOEs.
I think ultimately the long-term plan is to either reform these SOEs so that they're financially viable on their own, or get rid of them if there isn't a very solid case to have some of these SOEs.
Current revenues appear healthy, but there's a warning that they may not be sustained at these levels.
I think the rehabilitation at SARS is actually showing up quite nicely. I think it's one of the reasons why personal income tax receipts are holding up really quite well in what is a low growth environment. And there may be some more dividends to come from that. And if we're lucky, maybe commodity prices will hold up high for longer and we'll continue to enjoy transfers from mining companies.
The government could be enjoying greater tax revenue resources if it did more to help stimulate an environment that's conducive to economic growth. But even as there are moves to push for the private sector to invest in infrastructure and structural reforms in energy, rail and other sectors, there's said to be a lack of business confidence to invest as worries around security and the rule of law prevail.
Efforts that our president has been engaged in, whether it's on the energy sector and other areas, is being stymied by the inability of the state to bring law and order and to protect these investors and households who are keen to put South Africa first and therefore get us going forward.
If the Finance Minister announces that the government will take on a big chunk of Eskom's debt, that will be good for Eskom. But ultimately, it will mean that the regular taxpayer, that is you and I, will be liable for that debt, which will likely mean the government paying more in debt service costs, which will take away from spending on the ANC government's mandated priorities. Nompumelelo Siziba, SABC News, Johannesburg.